So Sean and I are extremely delighted to share with you some exciting stuff that we've been actually working on for the past couple of years. So we have been actually looking into, when we go into transformations, we have been looking into how do we actually drive digital transformation using observability platforms. So we want to talk about transformation in the context of observability, and we'll try and tie these two things together. So from the expectations of what you can actually expect to learn today, we want to first talk about the overall digital transformation context. And I know that all of us have our own experience of digital transformation. So we want to set some baselines with respect to what do we mean by digital transformation. Then we want to tie it back to the observability and how observability applies to transformation. What we are not going to do today is to do a deep dive into the observability concepts itself. If that is sort of new to you, that concept is new to you, we recommend that you check out Thoughtworks website. Among other things on the website, you would find a really nice podcast featuring Dr. Rebecca Parsons, who just gave our keynote earlier today. And you should also check out the work by Charity Majors and Liz Jones at Honeycomb if you haven't done that. So we're not going to go into a lot of details about observability concepts itself, but we'll talk about how that applies to the digital transformation. After that, we will basically be talking about how to build a representative platform. So that'll be an interesting part into how we actually build that solution, how we build these kinds of solutions at our clients. And then we'll talk about how that is actually tied into the transformational outcomes. Then after that, we're actually going to talk a little bit about the challenges and the approaches, essentially the patterns and anti-patterns in the process. And we'll talk about how should you be looking out for those challenges and how should you be solving that. And then we'll finish by doing a canonical KPIs. So the reason we call it canonical KPIs as opposed to just KPIs to measure the success of your transformational effort is that we believe these KPIs are what you should be really looking for when you're actually doing the transformational observability. But in your case, that mileage might vary. So I think look at these as a set of preliminary set of KPIs that you should be looking at. So specifically, what are you actually going to get out of this talk? So first thing that you would basically be understanding at the end of this discussion would be you will have a pretty good understanding of how to build a low-cost observability aggregator. And we'll define all these terms, but generally think of it like a platform that will provide you observability in a transformational setting. Then we will actually tie it back into your actual business problems. So you'll be hearing about a lot of very specific problems that we see on a day-to-day basis, and how does observability help in that process as we go through the transformation. And the last part that we're going to be talking about is those canonical KPIs that we discussed. So going further down, so basically, let's start with the digital transformation itself. Our definition of digital transformation is not that different from anything else that you might have seen elsewhere. So the key messages there is that if you are talking about a digital transformation, what you're really trying to do is to make sure that your customer experience is improved based on the future market conditions. So essentially, you are trying to improve what your customer's experience is today by actually going into future demands. So there are, from our point of view, there are at least like 4 key components here, right? I mean, so we definitely have the technology component, which is more or less the obvious one when anybody talks about digital transformation. Then you have data. So you heard some of the relevance of data from Dr. Parsons' discussion, the architecture earlier today. Then process. So process improvements are things that we always look for in a transformation. But of all these things, the 4th one, which is the organizational change, for us is the thing that actually brings it all together. So as we actually go through this discussion today, you would see a lot more references to organizational changes and how that actually helps bring it all together. It should also, I mean, this might be a good time for you to actually start asking, like, so how much time does it take to do a transformation, and and why should we have an observability for the transformation itself? So if you look at that Kubler-Ross graph at the bottom, one of the things that you would actually see there is the fact that it depends, right? There is no specific amount of time for a transformation. It depends on your problem, on your domain, as well as the maturity of your organization. So when you have things like that, the first thing that you should possibly be looking for is this concept of dip, which I'm sure a lot of you have come across this great work by Jonathan Smart over the past year, where that Sooner, Safer, Happier book, he went into a lot of details about how would that dip during a transformation be impactful. What that means is that when you have a larger transformation that is going to take a larger amount of time, your dip also is going to be fairly larger or deeper. So what that means is that when you are going through the transformation, you're initially going to see a dip in productivity, dip in your overall experience before things actually improve. So where does observability help here? So observability would ensure that when you're actually having that dip, your customer experience is not impacted at the level at which it might otherwise be. So now let's talk about the actual evolutionary mindset in a transformation, right? So when we go into clients, I'm sure you all probably would experience this too, is that when a client wants to go through a digital transformation, the first thing that they are is sort of in a state of confusion. They are basically invested in a whole bunch of tools. They're building dashboards. People know that they want to do all these things to get to the transformational stage, but all these tools and dashboards aren't really providing them the kind of outputs or the outcomes that they're looking for. So how do you actually change that? So that's the first step in the process. Acknowledging that state, saying that, okay, now we have invested in all these things. Now let's actually make sure that these dashboards are becoming insights in itself, as opposed to being a set of nice looking tools, nice looking dashboards that provide you all kinds of data. So that the transformation from your actual data dashboards to making it, making clear that your insights are available, that is that first step of that interim step. Once you go through that, that eventual step is going to be where you're going to have very clearly articulated value of all your platforms. So again, it's good to sort of refer back to the first presentation that if you're here for, we talked about the definition of platforms and all that. So in our context, when we talk about platforms here, we are talking about technical capability platforms. So these are the platforms that make sure that you can actually take advantage of the economies of scale by building common functions, abstracting out the common functions and providing this as a platform. So when you're in a transform state, what you would find is that the adoption of that platform or set of platforms have become part of your DNA, and your insights are now becoming actions. So until your insights become actions, you're going to have a tremendous amount of trouble really trying to tie it all back together, saying that how is this transformation, providing the eventual outcome that you're really looking for. So next, let's talk a little bit about the observability and how observability fits into what we are talking about here. So if you talk about the observability and transformation, from our point of view, there are at least 4 dimensions there. And the first one is the architectural effectiveness. So this is where we talk about how are we actually designing our product? How are we actually building our products? The second thing is the delivery at velocity. So great, you built a great product, you architected a great product. How efficient are you? How fast are you delivering that? Because if your delivery systems aren't efficient enough, you're going to have a tremendous lag in customers seeing the outcomes. The third part is like, let's say we delivered everything, we built something great, we delivered it. Now, how do we actually operate it? How do you make sure that your customer is actually using this the right way? And how are we actually supporting it the right way? And the fourth one being the overall customer experience. So what are those challenges that you see here? Again, the challenges could be like 3 broad areas. One is, of course, your product delivery itself is pretty ineffective. The second one would be like, because it's ineffective, your customers are starting to walk away. You're starting to see a lot more customer attrition. And eventually all this lack of visibility into the systems, as we talked about, people might actually buy a set of tools. We might actually go with the multiple vendors and end up creating these systems. So the question becomes like, how is that really bringing it all together as opposed to having a set of disparate systems? So all these things that we talked about, these challenges will have some kind of a observability prerequisites, which is what we are actually going to talk about now. So the classical definition of observability is something, again, if you have come across this, I'm sure you're very familiar with it. If you're not, don't worry about it. It's a very simple concept of what we are talking about here. Essentially, it's the ability to understand what's happening inside a system by observing or looking at its external outputs. So that's a simplistic definition of observability. So typically we apply this into a software system by looking at your traces, logs, metrics kind of stuff. What we want to do is to sort of extrapolate that into an organizational ecosystem and an organizational context. So when we are doing that, the idea is that we are really looking at the overall organizational ecosystem by looking at things that are visible and that can be measured. So those two are fairly operative words there, right? So because not every part of your system could be viewed easily, and not everything can be measured. So some of them might be a subjective measurement of how things are coming along. It may not be an objective measurement. So you have to really look at what's visible and what's measured. To actually put this in a model that that will work in an organizational ecosystem, what we have done is we have actually adapted Google's SRE view of service reliability. For those of you who have actually read the Google SRE book, I'm sure that model is fairly familiar to you. We have actually taken that and we are proposing a transformational aggregated observability model. So in this model, what you see is that there are literally 8 steps. I don't think the Google SRE has 8 steps in service reliability side. This is sort of like an adaptation from that. So what you would find is that there are 8 steps in the process, and each of these 8 steps are steps that you typically see in an SDLC. So if you're actually developing your software and delivering your software and operating it, you would actually see that these things will actually fit into a typical development lifecycle. So let's look into that a little bit in more detail to see what those steps would be. So, so what you're really looking at here is that if you were to take that pyramid, that 8-layer pyramid, and sort of apply it to your SDLC, you would find that there are very clear steps that has to happen in certain sequence, and there's significant amount of feedback loops, and there's a lot of agility involved in the process. But again, a simplistic view could be something like this, right? Where you have your portfolio is being managed in some level, and you want to make sure that that portfolio has some higher level of observability built in, so that you can actually predict what you're actually going to deliver to your customers in a more effective manner. And once that's there, your product teams, your product owners would sort of start defining what those things are that you're going to build into your product. Then your product development team start building it, and that's the place where more classical observability features would get instrumented into your product. And once you're doing that, you also have this ability to start using some of those technical capabilities or the platform capabilities. And those capabilities itself should have significant amounts of observability, which we would go into in a little bit detail. Then we talked about the whole idea of how do we actually make sure that when you're operating this product, that's the third dimension that we talked about earlier. When you're operating the product, what's the effectiveness in making sure that that is observed the right way? This is also a place where you might have actually come across some of the observability concepts in your day-to-day life. Where or classical monitoring concepts and those kinds of things are also included there. So this is where you talk about your infrastructure stability, your cloud service stability, cloud services observability, and eventually all of these things tie back into the topmost layer of that pyramid, which is where your customer experience, your business operations are happening the most efficient way possible. So this is how we actually see this whole model sort of fitting together. And when we talk about transformational observability, what we are really talking about is making sure that each step in this process is observed independently and then brought together as a single pane of glass so that you have a more holistic, coherent view of how things work. So after this, we would love to now get into some of the other key aspects of things with respect to the technology behind how do we actually propose setting up an observability platform and what the outcomes for that are. I'll hand it off to Sean for this part. Go ahead, Sean.
All right, so for practical example, let's look at a case study in which we went into a mid-sized financial organization. They had a pretty visionary leadership team, and they were looking for new ideas to grow the company. And they're in a market with a huge potential for growth. So they need to stay ahead of competition that's coming in frequently with new feature releases. And they want to make sure they can keep up with a stable product that also has frequent feature releases. But their current code base and processes challenge that. They have a very monolithic design. They have traditional waterfall processes in place that you would see at a large enterprise. They are also executing on the next generation of their software, So they need to balance the legacy code and the incidents that might come along with running that in production with what they're developing now. They also have a lot of different tools for monitoring. So you can think of traditional tools like ServiceNow, Dynatrace, those sorts of enterprise tools. Some of them doing similar things for different people across silos, but not all of their SDLC environments are covered. So Dev, QA, those sorts of environments, maybe licensing restrictions or per seat licenses can prevent from being able to look at those. So we wanted to go in with a tool agnostic value proposition to cover all these tools under a single pane of glass across all their environments. We do want to make sure we preserve their portfolio so we're not impacting their current systems. And we also know they're heavily invested in Microsoft Azure and other Microsoft technologies. So we want to be able to take advantage of that. The first thing we had to look at was a build versus buy decision, because there are a lot of tools on the market that port themselves as observability tools. The first piece is, can those tools give us what we need? There might be, some gaps with some of the wide tool set that the company has. We also need the staff in-house if we're going to develop and maintain and support this going forward. This is a product. This is not a project that has a defined life cycle. So we have to make sure those are in place. Obviously, total cost of ownership. It's not just licensing costs. If we buy a commercial tool versus in-house, we also have to consider the opportunity cost of what we're not developing in order to build an observability platform. You do want to consider whether it's core to the value proposition of your business when you build something like this. Most businesses are not going to be selling observability to their customers, but if you look at what your customers could be losing by you not having observability in-house, it really does become core to your value proposition at that point. There will be a longer time to market. Typically, when you're developing something, you can thin slice and put it out incrementally, but before you get the full functionality, it's going to take longer than if you just installed something from the commercial market. And then you also need somebody in-house to evangelize this. Technical product owner is a wonderful role to have in place for that. And we were able to put all these things into place so that building really did make sense for us so that we could customize this to the needs of the business. So once we knew we wanted to build it, we had to make some key decisions. And here are a few of the ones that we had to make. We did not want this observability platform to be a system of record. We wanted the original systems to continue to hold their data and be referenced because there are large investments in them and skill sets in them to take advantage of, but we want that single pane of glass across them. So our platform can contain aggregated data that's non-sensitive so that we can provide it to anyone in the organization, regardless of role, so that they can drive insights from it. But we also need to realize that if somebody does need to dig into something, debug something, look at the actual numbers, they're going to have to go back to that original system. For storing the data in the system, we have static data that we want to store in an external database or some other store so that we can look at it over time. If you think about tools like incident management, you may see the status of a ticket, the status of an investigation. For a workflow system, the status of a user story. But we want to be able to evaluate how those things change over time. So by pulling them into the observability platform, we'll have a very easy way to do that. There are other systems, however, that stream their data, looking at CPU, memory usage, those sorts of things that are being compiled in the potentially microseconds and ticks. We do not want to ingest all that data because that really would just blow up the storage requirements, blow up the cost. And there's really no need to do that because that type of data, these systems have built-in tools and APIs to do that time series analysis of it. So we can depend on that. For the pipeline to get the data in, we wanted to use an event-based system so that as these events occur, we can ingest them into the system in real time to be able to show customers what insights they need. We also wanted to make sure that there was a standard logging and tracing system for internal applications, because a big part of the observability of this is not, is my system functioning at all, but it's, is my system functioning properly? And you need to have those custom events, customs tracings, custom heartbeat that would come into the system so that we can see how these things are doing. Now, while event-based eliminates polling, there might be some systems that don't support it. So we're going to have to plan for being able to connect to those systems and still get that real-time data. And there might be some internal systems that don't support the standard logging system that we would choose. So we're going to have to make sure that we make allowances for those. The other key part of this is we want to make sustaining investments in the observability platform by setting a model for the future of development. I had mentioned that they were in kind of a waterfall, monolithic code base, rigorous change procedures. We wanted to show them a better way of software development to make them more efficient so they could get these new features out for their applications in a fast period of time. So we're going to use event-driven microservice architecture here so that we can evolve quickly and deploy quickly. We want to shift left security in the process. We don't want to involve a security team at the very end, kind of like what was mentioned earlier, so that we're addressing it built in from the ground up. We want to use infrastructure as code and CI/CD practices so that our entire system is defined as code and can be incremented and versioned and redeployable very quickly. We want to also think about high availability, fault tolerance, disaster recovery from the beginning of the project. We don't want to have to re-architect at the end because we realize that we can only give a certain uptime and it needs to be higher. We want to bake that in from the initial architecture. We also want to use the practice of observability-driven development here because we're really trying to practice what we're going to be preaching to the organization about it once we have the observability platform in place. So any cross-service traffic between microservices, any applications that are running with custom logging, health of all our infrastructure, all of these things are going to be thought about from the beginning so that as we develop them, we know the observability is in place for our own system so that we can address problems when or even before they occur. And the last piece here, observe the platform with the platform after we build it. We want to make sure the customers are getting the experience we thought they were, and by using the platform on a daily basis, we can ensure that. Find those problems early and incentivize the team to either put in self-healing systems or dashboards that allow them to see things that maybe are starting to go wrong before there's an outage of some sort. And then any SLOs we put out to the business, we can validate those. So it's not just saying that we're going to be up for a certain period of time and then we find out we can't meet that. Well, maybe somebody wants to put in 5 nines of availability and then we realize upon using the system, well, maybe that's not feasible for us in this case. And then we can evaluate the business case to find out if we actually need that sort of availability. So we're able to validate those SLOs by using and exercising the system on a daily basis. So we know all these decisions in place. I just want to briefly go into the key components of it and the technology choices that we made to enable this. Now, for any given system, you might not want to use these. We, again, wanted to depend on that Azure partnership that the organization already had, but I think the types of tools we use are pretty indicative of how some of these problems can be solved. By using Kubernetes, we can use the Azure Kubernetes service, and that's that microservices design. We can use a service bus for event-driven architecture. Azure Log Analytics is a key value data store that's optimized for time series data. So as we pull in that static data, we can put it into a time series set and do that analysis that we want. Application Insights ties into the Microsoft stack very well for logging and tracing. And the last piece for the front end, because that's really where the users are going to interact with this system, we want to use Grafana. It's open source. It gives us the powerful and flexible visualizations and allows us to connect to data sources in a very flexible way. So I wanted to go through here how the technical challenges we ran into that we anticipated were solved by some of the technology that we chose. So we wanted to access streaming data from a source system, and then we wanted to use event-based systems, in knowing that not everything might support webhooks. By using Grafana, Grafana has data sources with an SDK that we could build our own so that we could query APIs in a polling fashion if needed, or even on demand, preferably when dashboards are loaded, to get that real-time data retrieval for our customers. We did find that once we connected the data from some of these third-party systems, that teams wouldn't know the internal structures of those to know how to query the data effectively from them. But with Grafana, we could provide dashboard templates with commonly used queries and visualizations that most teams would be able to use primarily in the monitoring space, so that they could just copy those dashboards and then be able to modify them as they see fit to enhance them for their particular solution. The organization, even though we wanted to use application insights, does not have a standard logging format right now across teams. And it was really beyond the scope of what we were trying to do to introduce a standard logging format to all the different teams in the organization. But by using a key value data store as opposed to a relational database or something similar, we can capture logs per team in different ways without having to worry about a schema. So now teams can take ownership of how their data is queried and displayed by providing it into the system in the way that will work best for them to be able to drive insights. The last piece is more of a people than a technical issue. But with these myriad of systems in place, it's not very easy to do cross-tool querying and be able to query why an incident is related to a user story that was deployed to a cloud service, for instance. So people just weren't even thinking about those types of cross-service queries that they may be able to do because they could never do it before. But with this combination of ingestion to a central data store and accessing streaming data with Grafana queries, we could really show the state of the possible to people and really start to evangelize the platform and get them thinking about those types of insights that they can derive. And once we did that, the floodgates opened and people started to come up with all sorts of ideas as to the insights they would want to see, and started figuring out how to create those dashboards from them. So we have the system in place now. We have all the technical pieces and challenges worked out. What sort of outcomes do we get from this transformation? And this is going to go back to those 4 key pieces. So first we look at architectural effectiveness. This is, engineering teams and architects are going to be able to look at dashboards and validate that the architectural decisions they made along the way are giving them the results that they expected, and look at real usage of the system to make tweaks and able to enhance the experience. So you can take quantitative data and look at A/B testing, for instance, between 2 versions of a service or front end to see what's better and ensure consistency across services. Team leads can see if the team is functioning effectively by looking at delivery velocity. They can make sure that their continuous delivery is functioning effectively and find if there's any roadblocks that might be affecting that and stopping them from being able to deliver regularly without introducing defects to the system. Operations and SREs can identify inefficiencies in operational requirements of the system. They can identify problems before they occur and avoid those incidents that it's all hands on deck to solve by seeing maybe that a system's starting to become overloaded or a certificate is about to expire. You can also practice FinOps with this, which is evaluating how much it's going to cost you to run in the cloud before you get to production in those pre-production environments. So you can start to estimate as you deploy new services whether or not maybe the service you're using is more expensive than you need it to be, and there's another service that's cheaper and maybe can get the same job done, and find baselines for performance that allow you to optimize better for cost as well. And the most important piece, in my opinion, here is the customer experience, because that's how they're going to interact with the system. So these true observability features will tell you experiences that make the customer's life more difficult. Maybe they are clicking through way too many screens to get somewhere. Workflow modeling of how they're interacting with your system, and how your business is functioning as customers work through your system. Now, we can also find whether or not a problem is even as big a deal as maybe you think it is, because not all problems need to be prioritized for fixes right away. If you have a problem that maybe the internal team technically feels like is a big deal, but your observability system is showing you that 5 people out of 100,000 are actually hitting that problem, maybe you don't want to prioritize it as highly to fix it, and you can optimize your investments that way. So I'll hand it back to Ajay now to talk about some of the challenges and approaches that we encountered.
Thank you, Sean. So when you talk about challenges, the way we actually looked at it again holistically is that there are 6 different categories of challenges. The number one is, I'm sure you all have seen that when you starting to do some investments into a transformation, what we call as a value realization fallacy. So the moment we actually make some investments into it, however, we actually try and manage that, there is that impatience that's going to set in day one. Like, are we actually delivering on what we are investing on? So this is something that pretty much every organization struggle with. And the less mature the organization is, which by definition is the case when they're actually going through a transformation, they're going to have more of those concerns. So that immediate payback has to be addressed through multitude of things, which again ties back to the initial point that we are making with respect to why that organizational change component is so important here. The second thing is that us versus what we call as us versus them. What this really means is that when you go through a transformation, not every part of the organization is going to actually be hit day one, right? So this is actually going to be some leading parts as well as the lagging parts. So in the leading parts, people who are actually in the teams that are in the leading parts, they would actually see the value immediately. They would start seeing the impact almost immediately. But the lagging parts, the teams that are on the lagging side of things, will not. And naturally, the way it's going to work is that more of the engineering teams and the actual internal product teams, those are the people who are actually going to see this value early on, and more customer-facing teams would see that less and less. So they would find that the velocity of the work is actually reducing, and that can create a lot of alarm. So that's where we also need to go back to that Kubler-Ross model that we were showing earlier and understand where that dip is going to come in from a productivity point of view and try and manage that more proactively. Autonomy for delivery teams is an interesting concept. We know that pretty much all the technical capability platforms and the continuous delivery, a lot of these things move towards providing more autonomy for delivery teams. You've already heard, I'm sure you'll hear again later today, as to why DevOps as a team is a probably outdated concept, and DevOps as a concept that everybody uses and as a culture that everybody uses is the right way to do it. So autonomy comes in that context, but how much autonomy makes sense, right? Is it okay to have 80% autonomy and be more efficient, or do we have to religiously look for 100% autonomy in cases? I mean, the answer from our point of view, our experience is very straightforward. You have to look at it from the point of view of what it makes sense for a transformation in your part of the organization. So the next one is the developer effectiveness. So if you haven't read the work by Tim Cochran on Thoughtworks website and Martin Fowler's website, you should definitely check it out. Tim is actually speaking later today too, feel free to attend that if you can. This is an area that we are seeing more and more as one of the key components of the whole transformational journey. So how effective can we make our developers? And again, there is no a clear list of things that says that here are the things that you should be looking into, here are things that you should do. But what we are really talking about is how do we actually provide that faster feedback loop for your development community so that they can actually, and Sean gave some examples of this one, right? With respect to, are there like embers versus fires? Should we be worrying about all the problems versus the most important problems? Another challenge that we have seen is that some sort of an unhealthy affinity towards accelerate 4 key metrics and other industry standards. When I say unhealthy affinity, what I mean is that 4 key metrics makes a lot of sense from a delivery point of view. But if you're really starting to take 4 key metrics and apply it to an operations team, the way they actually do things, it may not make a lot of sense in the context of what they're trying to do. So you have to really be thoughtful in understanding where are you actually going to use some of these industry standard metrics and do it the way that you should be doing. And eventually, this comes back to being able to tie it all together. So why did we actually put that as a challenge? Because if we don't really try and put that together, tie it all together into a holistic scorecard approach, you're going to have the challenge of, depending on who's looking at a particular problem or a dashboard or data at any given point of time, the decisions actually are going to be fairly disparate and that may not actually come together. So when we look at these, and I think Vivek or somebody was asking something about what are the kind of things that we should be measuring, what are the kind of data that we should be looking for, KPIs, right? So we call this canonical KPIs because we believe these are the basic set of data that we should be looking for. These are the basic set of KPIs one should be aware of and be proactively working towards. So that means that that doesn't mean that you won't have something that is significantly more than this, or you may not tweak this. You will actually do that, again, depending on your situation. Use this as, if you're using this as a model, use this as a starting point and start building on it. Here again, we have actually mapped each of these canonical KPIs or set of KPIs to those 8-layer maturity model that we were talking about earlier. On the portfolio side of things, what you're really looking for is like, are we able to deliver everything in your portfolio on time? I mean, that is the whole idea of managing a portfolio. But also, you would also want to be looking for if there are things that's going to get delayed, because portfolios will almost always be impacted in one form or the other. You want to make sure that the expected impacts are higher than the unexpected impacts, which means that if you move your resources away from your portfolio because of changing business conditions or something like that, that is perfectly acceptable. But you need to know that data to make the decision. On the application side of things, this is something I'm sure if you have seen the 4 key metrics and the Accelerate book, you know all about the delivery lead times. So those are the kind of that's the kind of thing that we typically look for, and you always want that your DLT to trend downwards. Platform adoption metrics. So here again, the definition of platform is this technical capability platforms. When you talk about technical capability platforms, you want to make sure that the adoption of these platforms are inherently trending up. But it's always going to plateau out at some point, right? And again, it's almost impossible to expect that any platform that you build would satisfy 100% of your clientele or your customers. So you have to really understand what's that. There's always that 80-20 rules. Let's try and figure out where would we actually be plateauing out a particular platform's adoption. But keeping track of that and making sure that that is happening is a key aspect to how we would actually measure the success of this. On the infrastructure side of things, this is probably one of the more popular ones, right? You really want to look at things like, are the issues related to your infrastructure trending down? I mean, so if you have, you could have your issues related to your application, your infrastructure, your data, it could be anywhere, but you want to make sure that anything related to your infrastructure has to trend down. Similarly, on the middleware side of things. So because these are, so one of the terms I've heard used is that self-inflicted wounds that you could really try and avoid. So Sean mentioned a little bit about the FinOps side of things, and this is a huge aspect of what we really see today at the clients. With all the new cloud services coming in, with all the public cloud providers and anybody who's providing cloud services, there is this propensity to use all this greatest and the latest set of services. But does that really make sense for your transformation, your service? That's the thing that you need to know about it. So you need to be observing that and really proactively addressing that. So checking the cost of your subscriptions, per domain, and slice and dice it the way that makes sense to you, so that you don't end up spending more to actually operate your system as opposed to what revenue that it's bringing in. On the incident side of things, again, this is again a no-brainer. What we're really looking for is that if by doing all of these things, if your incidents, your customer visible incidents are trending down, there is something fundamentally wrong, right? Again, keep in mind that there is that dip aspect of it there, but as you actually get out of that valley, you're trying to figure out if that is the way you're actually going to be going through the transformation. You need to be looking for incidents that are trending down. On the service health side of things, and other kind of things that we typically look for are things like availability per region and the health check, for every service, and these things are, much more easily tracked and observed using the platforms like what we're talking about. ultimately, we do all these things. What does it mean, right? I mean, so if we do all of this, and if your customer satisfaction isn't improving, and another thing like customer attrition isn't actually going down, then you are still not making an impact. And as I said earlier, right, it is extremely difficult to see those things day one. It's going to take some time for you to get there. But once you get there, that's that ultimate North Star that you're looking for. All right, so to conclude, so some of the things that we talked about here, right? One was the fact that the benefit of this transformational observability is that you can do this with minimal amount of additional tooling investment. So this is not a tooling problem by any stretch of imagination, right? Even though every vendor would say that, hey, buy your tool, and this is actually going to solve your problem. This is not something that you really need a bunch of expensive tools to solve. The other part that we kept reinforcing was the fact that this is a holistic approach, right? This is, there are multiple layers to this, which is where we talked about that multiple 8-layer maturity model. You need to make sure that this is all brought together as a single pane of glass. And again, the KPIs that you'll be looking for each of those layers would vary depending on your business. But that feedback loop is supremely important. So the reason for that feedback loop is that because if you don't know what is happening immediately, you're going to spend more time going to delay your transformation further. And another interesting thing that we see is that pretty much all the popular, I'm not going to name names, but all the popular monitoring and observability tools and platforms out there, they are all starting to think about the problem at this level as opposed to a particular service level or a product level, right? They're starting to think about it in a more holistic way. So just to, as a parting thought, so for those of you who are familiar with Robert Peel, I'm sure this will resonate with you. So we coined this Peelian observability principle. The idea here is that in order for us to understand that whether these kinds of observability platforms that help with transformation successful or not depends purely on ensuring that there is lack of issues in the first place, as opposed to finding all these issues, self-healing all the time. That's a journey. That's where you start from. But eventually where you want to get to is to the idea that you're actually going to have a more observability-driven design, which is that architectural effectiveness aspect that we talked about. Once you have that lack of issues in the first place, that's where you really start going to see the biggest bang for the buck. And how do you do that? I mean, this is there is no magic in there, right? I mean, so it's about designing your products better. This goes back to some of the architectural principles that we talked about earlier. But you also need to build significant amounts of trust and accountability within the organization. This is where that organizational change aspect would be relevant. And governance is something that we all frown at some level when we hear about governance, but without some sort of a lightweight governance, this isn't doable, at least in our experience. So those lightweight, when we say lightweight governance, it could be automated governance, it could be a combination of automated and manual, but that perception of governance, or the idea that the governance is there to actually make things work well, is something that we all have to take away. So with that, we are done with our content that we wanted to present. We'd be happy to answer any questions. Brandon, Scott, do we have questions that we should be talking?
Yes, we're right at the top of the hour, but there was one question that Abbas Raza asked that I thought was quite good. They ask, were all of the KPIs displayed on a single dashboard? And as a follow-up, are all of the KPIs visible to everyone on the team?
Absolutely. So I think when we talk about the holistic approach to the KPIs, or holistic approach to providing this data, the idea is to provide everything in one place. So depending on the clients, some of the things that clients do is that they actually look at some of these multiple KPIs. They create their own, like, your red, amber, green kind of a system based on that. So, and with respect to the visibility available to everybody, absolutely. No, so the more transparent that we are, more open, we would be. I mean, so one of the reasons why, I don't know if Sean went into that, one of the reasons why we chose Grafana as a platform, because we wanted to do more open source, something that we are not using Grafana's licensed version even for this particular implementation. The whole idea was that we wanted to make sure that everybody in the organization can see the same data, and they all can make decisions based on the data that they see.
And I would
Ajay,
add
Sean.
there that,
Oh, I'm Sean, please.
I would just add there that again, we wanted to make sure that we weren't ingesting sensitive data into the system so that we could not have to granularize permissions to anybody. And they could really assemble the data however worked best for their role and what they were looking for.
That's great. Ajay, Sean, thank you so much for this presentation. I really do appreciate it. We are at the top of the hour, which means it's our next break. It's your challenge now to get outside, get some sunshine on your face, get up, move around, get your blood flowing so you can be awake and attentive for the next 3 talks that are coming up at the quarter hour. We have 3 short talks coming up next, 3 quick 15-minute talks, one on machine learning, one on product innovation, and the last on lightweight architecture governance. So thank you for joining us so far this morning. We'll see you back at the quarter hour where you can have our next round of lightning talks.